have time now for debate. What I thought we should start, I think we should start with the debate among the panel here, and then after that we will open up for debate with the rest of you. Because I'm sure there will be things among the panel here that you would like to comment on, and some of these comments may eventually lead on to new questions and further debate. And I'm sure there will be among the audience someone who also will have important contributions to make. So let us begin. I think I like the idea of the wish list. Yeah. And in a way, I think we should start with the wish list because you had a wish list to linguists, and maybe a linguist might have a wish list to the archaeologist. But starting with your wish list, and I would like to hear some comments on it. Personally, I should like to add mythology, and all terminology linked to mythology because we have it from the very beginning.
Yeah, social institutions. Yeah, I want to know about social institutions. The Mannerbunde, perhaps not just individual research on individual roots, but also research on institutions that can be extracted from Proto-Indo-European society.
Would you add something? On second thought?
Well, one other area which sometimes is tackled is the obvious loanwords from one Indo-European group into another that must have been done in prehistoric periods. I can recall, but cannot remember the name. It was a book, I think, on Slavic linguistics, written in German, in which the loanword vocabulary was serrated into different periods and attempted to do so, indicating changes. And we do this also with Germanic into Uralic, for example, where people have tried to put the things. In other words, if you want a complete prehistory of Europe, you're going to not only be looking at the loanwords that went in before language separation, but you're going to want the words that went in after language separations as well, when more people were in contact with one another.
And that would be very useful for the archaeologist to know about, because that puts certain demands of the geographical locations of certain scenarios.
Yeah.
Would you want to add something?
Well,
the wish list?
with regard to these loanwords there's a lot of loanwords from Celtic and Germanic, of course, Proto-Celtic into Proto-Germanic.
And what do they suggest?
Exactly, that would be my question. If the homeland would have been in Iberia.
The cultural superiority of the Celts.
Yeah, of course, the Germanic tribes, they were barbarians, of course, like the Slavs were barbarians to the Germanic tribes because they...
Is that the image that the language...
You don't borrow from barbarians, that's the rule. Yeah.
Really?
It sounds kind of...
But I mean, these people, if they came out of the Iberian Peninsula and if they were the Proto-Celts, certainly Belgians came out of the Iberian Peninsula and they had been, they came from collapsed complex society.
Mm-hmm. Then when and where would you suggest that the loan contacts would have taken place from Celtic?
Along the Rhine border, in Holland, the whole way down through to around to Switzerland and that area even down to northern Italy.
So, moving the homeland from Austria, let's say, to Iberia doesn't have a consequence for.
No, because they spread out.
They spread out.
Yeah, so they in a way they fill in the gaps where the recorded were people or Proto-Germans were not.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have a historic religion here, and that's really close to my heart because I think that was one of the things that was missing on my wish list.
Well, yes, what I could just let me say a few words. I'm not a linguist, but I've had some training in comparative linguistics. But what I've been mostly working on as an historian of religions is comparative poetics, which is of course a sub-discipline of comparative linguistics. The big difference is that when we look at poetics, we can not only say something about the vocabulary, but also, as Calvert Watkins once put it, what the Indo-Europeans talked about. Some of the themes are really giving us a window into this society. And it's not only a matter of vague thematic correspondences. In some cases, we can really reconstruct formula. And I would like to pick up two things from David Anthony's talks. Remember, he talked about an area of hospitality, patron-client relations, and an area of conflict. And I think that religion, when we look at the religious traditions of early Indo-European peoples, we can also say something about how these two areas were connected in religion, because I can see two groups interacting in these texts. It's not so much a tripartite society, but very much a dipartite society. If we look at the early Vedic society, two groups, that is, ritual specialists, including poets, they belong to the same groups, and aristocrats, warriors, a warrior elite. And what is happening here is that, of course, that cattle is involved in different ways, because that's the salary, the fee that the ritual specialist receives from the king, belonging to this warrior elite. And some of the things that the poet, the ritual specialists, are talking about in their poetry is, of course, conflict. And either in a very direct sense, in the form of praise poetry, but also in a more in a transferred sense, talking about gods defeating monstrous beings, for instance, that is reflecting conflict in one way or another. So I think there is a lot of things that can be said about these two groups that is not necessarily visible in the archaeological material. And also we notice,
or maybe they are.
Perhaps, but I have to. I mean, I think it's important to emphasize that when we notice all these techniques that went into creating a chariot, for instance,
yeah,
and all these wonderful artifacts that we find in the graves, but poetry is not something that we find in the graves.
No, but what I understand from you is that what you're saying is, among other things, I learned from you just 2 minutes ago that the two groups are also language group we have studied that share these things is early Greek and,
yes,
and Sanskrit, right?
Yes.
So what you say is that there is a connection here in terms of some shared institution, some shared poetry.
Yes.
And what I tried to show in my book with Thomas Larsson, The Rise of Bronze Age Society, was exactly that we could show that the divine twins and the sun maiden, this triad, had all their parallels in the material culture of the Bronze Age, starting 1800 BC or 2000 BC and going down to the Iron Age. Basically, very, very clear in Europe, but basically stretching over the whole area. And the proposition was that spread with the chariot horizon. So that was an example that you can actually use archaeology. You can identify in the archaeology some of the gods and institutions that you talk about.
Yes.
And the archaeologists can then add precision to the dating and the geographical spread.
Yes.
And I think what's interesting, what you say, is that because previously, those who studied Indo-European mythology, they always said that, Greek mythology, we cannot really make it fit, but I see a lot of fits. And now you are coming and telling that there are these fits. I think it's wonderful.
The most striking parallels in the vocabulary, poetic vocabulary, of course, is between Indo-Iranian and Greek.
Yeah.
And the chariot and the parts of the chariot. I was really fascinated by that because the very advanced techniques that this requires is transferred into the poetry, because the Vedic and Greek poets talked about their own craft in terms of in these terms. To create a poem was often described in those terms. To make a chariot, they spoke about themselves as craftsmen, as in those metaphoric terms. So they are specialists, they are professionals, they want money, they are not really, I mean, this is not a hobby.
And also, the chariot race was frequently used in this poetry as a metaphor for life itself. And the turning point of a chariot race, which the turning point we still use as a metaphor for our lives. And the turning point of a chariot race, when you went out and you had to, if you went too close to the pole, you had to slow down too much. And if you went too far out, you were going too fast, you might spill. And choosing how you hit the turning point in this poetry was a point that's filled with tension. And if you do it just right, then you win in life. And that whole operation was used as a metaphor for the course of a human life itself. So, yeah.
And of course, the agonistic aspect of both poetry and of, ritualized forms of behavior that are agonistic in nature have a relation to conflict and to war. It's a ritualized.
Finally, I would like to ask a question to Morten here. Because now we have the privilege of having the genetic person here, because what you presented to us, these few examples you showed, was really that we have some from megalithic DNA, and that takes us back to the Mediterranean. We have some from Östi. He had no modern successors except in Sardinia. Right. We have some from the linear Band pyramid. Yeah, they have some modern successors, but not a lot. And the Mesolithic people are virtually extinct in modern populations, except for certain areas. Yes. So in a way, as I see it from your presentation, we have a huge black hole.
It's extremely patchy. I mean, we have
so in a way, is the third millennium that we're working with, and the second millennium is. Do you think we can fill that hole?
That's certainly my hope. I mean, it's a hugely understudied area, and very little has been done in terms of European archaeogenetics, I have to say. And there are a few studies, and those studies have focused mainly on the Neolithicization process, not very much on the actual what happened in the second, third millennium.
And we have this famous study from Eulau or Eulau, of this Cordova group where they show how they're interrelated. So it's a rather sort of specific.
That's true. They're looking at kinship in the different graves, and not so much the bigger picture.
Oh, not the bigger picture.
And that's really what we hope to be doing with something. And I think we're not the only group working on this. So I think.
Soon.
After Christmas, we had hope that you would bring some news here, but it takes time.
Yeah.
That takes time.
Yeah, it's interesting that 2 years ago, really last year, if you had ancient DNA on 3 individuals, you're in science. But with what you're doing, pretty soon it's going to be 200.
Yeah, we are raising the bar.
Yeah. And I'm working on some projects where we're working with many tens or hundreds of individuals. So very soon it's going to go from these tiny little samples of 2 or 3 individuals to large population.
What you're saying is that Harvard, they're setting up a new lab that should compete with Copenhagen?
Yeah, at Harvard. David Reich at Harvard, who worked on the Denisova DNA and the Neanderthal DNA.
So you guys should keep in contact.
Yeah,
we're not in competition.
I mean,
the genetics guys.
But it's true. I mean, what is happening these days on the molecular front is that sequencing cost per base pair, you can say, per DNA sequence you're generating is dropping hugely. But at the same time, the level of ambition is increasing just as fast. So it's not like it's becoming cheaper to publish in the end.
No, I will not tell how much money we put into you, but it was a lot. Guus?
Yeah, I would, on my wish list would be to have a clearer picture of the interaction between Indo-Europeans and non-Indo-Europeans archaeologically. So on the first level, what happened, when exactly, when and where did the Indo-Europeans acquire their limited package of agricultural crops, for instance? That would be a really important question, because we knew they had some agriculture, but not the whole package. But
Yeah.
where did it happen? Where did they acquire this knowledge? And then, well, I'm a Germanicist, and after your talk about Jutland, what happened in Jutland, would it, for instance, be possible to see these in the funnel deeper culture, the single grave culture, actually, if there still were different types of...
Oh, there were
settlements
different.
and-
I mean, the picture is extremely patchy in terms of culture and ethnicity and economies. So these where single grave culture groups come in, and they take over these areas that were not too heavily settled, and dominate from there. And so on the Danish islands, you still have the surviving megalithic people. In certain areas of Poland, Northern Europe, you still have something called global amphra or other groups, and sometimes they live like there's only like a river between them. And they're totally different, in cultural outfit, in economy, everything. But the quarter where single grave culture got the upper hand in the long run, it seems. But they didn't invade the Danish islands, but small groups moved over and a gradual integration took place. So it's really after the first migrations. There are of course some expansions, some combats, but it's a lot about integration.
But this integration has to take place with a differentiation in the prestige attached to certain languages. So that in the end, in the long run, the Corded-ware people ended up having alliances, tribal alliances, that other people wanted to join.
Yeah, because the Corded-ware were in charge of the whole North European temperate area, and whereas the remaining groups of TRB or other, they gradually became like isolated islands.
And this is really shocking, I still think, because when you look at the picture in modern day Europe, I mean, it's really shocking to see how successful the Indo-Europeans were at linguistically colonizing the area.
Yeah.
So could you actually see this in the archaeology? Could you see this happening in the archaeological record, and could you tell us how exactly these people interacted with each other, and or if you have different settlement with a river in between only, could you step in as a geneticist and check
Certainly we will do that, and we are doing this.
I mean, potentially, the thing is at the moment we don't actually know what we're going to look at. The first thing is when you want to deal with these things is more or less to establish, you could say, a reference database to some extent. You need to know how genetically different are the separate cultures in both space and time. Once you've got that established, you can then go on to estimate gene flow or migration rates and these things between the cultures. So at the moment we don't really know what we're dealing with, but yes, if they're separate enough genetically, sure. I mean, it also depends on how much data you actually need to look into these things. I mean, how informative it is, and it's at present we honestly don't know to what level we can take this, but
this would be absolutely amazing if this could be done in the near future.
Well, I would say that the vehicle through which the vector through which the conversion of language took place is these patron-client guest-host relationships. That's I think that's what they brought in.
That's what gave them the upper hand.
That's what gave them the upper hand, because before that, people had lived in nucleated villages where one village and another might have been in competition with each other rather than establishing these very close long-distance relationships.
So it's a social system that has a horizontal outlook and which is geared to add horizontal social network, expand social networks,
to incorporate,
and send warriors and sons out.
Yeah.
Versus one that's more internal in its outlook and in its social organization.
The networking charts that you showed for Southeastern Europe, the tell cultures, you look at the networks which are based on metal, I believe. You showed one image. And there's a series of unconnected little regional, local networks. And then the Bronze Age comes in, and there are these long
Yes.
lines between the networks, and that's it right there in one picture.
Is there more to say from the panel here to the wish lists? And should we ask for similar wish lists from the linguists?
Well, I have one more wish, which is that although it seems like archaeologists are willing to enter the field of linguistics just because we have 3 archaeologists here, in fact, we're somewhat anomalous.
We are rare breed.
Yeah.
I've been at Queen's University for 38 years. I have never given a lecture on Indo-Europeans there.
From one of the great experts on Indo-Europeans and archaeology.
So
Boring.
So you know how privileged you are to have him here.
And I
go
have
abroad and do it, yes.
And the same thing, my archaeological colleagues, they'll look at our bitware studies and development of transportation systems and economy and say, oh, Dave, I like that archaeology, it's great, you're doing great. Why are you wasting your time with this language stuff? They just don't understand. So my wish list is really for more archaeologists. I don't know how to affect this transformation, but this kind of thing is a good start.
But I think we have to raise the theoretical and the methodological bar to become more trustworthy and to create more interested fields where we can discuss at a level of social organization and institutions and more complex things. I think that is a way forward. But now, I invite the audience here.
Because simply processes that closely related individuals will breed with each other, and the gene pool will fluctuate quite rapidly in one direction. And I wonder whether these processes also, I mean,
for language.
Yeah, exactly.
For language, yeah.
Dialects and stuff. If you have people on a small, not many people on a small island, within a few generations, the language will evolve quite rapidly. Are these things taken into account when you study languages, or how?
We have to
do we have
answer,
it's like a mutation rate, for example, in languages?
Well, it's difficult, I think. It's very difficult because some languages, some island languages, they are amazingly stable, like Icelandic, for example. For example, it's taken as an example very often. But then other languages that are isolated, they start having a lot of drift, so they mutate in all directions. So isolation doesn't necessarily do the same to language.
But it's also very clear that if you look at something like New Guinea, where they have no interaction of any significance, all these local groups develop all kinds of dialects or even different languages.
Exactly. This is
so this, to me, this looks like a kind of Neolithic situation. That once you start getting these really frequent interactions, something happens also to the language, of course. Okay, now you want to comment. Yeah, Birgit, and then.
Okay, what is very nice for us to get from the archaeologists that are studies that are concerned, as you say, with more complex things, more going into the whole of the society rather than simply pots or weapons or whatever. To give an example, you in your Bronze Age book, you comment on young men typically going to their mother's home because there is this patron-client relationship. And this is something of an eye-opener, really, because from a linguistic point of view, one has been wondering, how come that the vocabulary seems to point to patrilinear and patrilocal society, and on the other hand, you have all these accounts and also some linguistic evidence that the mother's brother and the mother's father are not unimportant persons. And early on, you had maybe even still all these theories about cross-cousin marriage and so on, and now one can see maybe that's not really necessary. Maybe it can be explained just by the way the cultural exchange goes and the way the society is built up. So more studies of that kind would be tremendously welcome.
It was just a comment on the Icelandic that you said earlier. I am from Iran and I read poetry from 9th century from Panjkent, which is in Tajikistan, and I almost understand it 100%, while I don't think a Norwegian person understands Icelandic.
It's true that also languages that are not isolated, they also can remain stable for a millennium. Like for instance Russian, it's surrounded by languages and has been invaded by dozens of tribes, and but it has also remained stable for I think 1,000 years. So this is another counterexample. I think it's extremely complicated. There's not a rule of thumb to say that isolated languages remain stable and language in context are not. This is not true.
But of course, there were these guys who that responded to your question. I mean, there have been scientists who have tried to apply these phylogenetic models on the language, but they knew not a lot about language and came to some surprising results.
I have a small comment to make when it comes to contact between different groups speaking related languages. I was just earlier today talking about with Vicky about this. Just as a I mean, if we as an thought experiment, if we think of these groups who spoke Proto-Indo-Iranian and groups speaking pre-Greek or Proto-Greek, is it not possible that these languages would be so closely related that these groups could actually talk to each other and understand each other, although they recognize the differences between the languages, so they could borrow words and vocabulary and translate them into their own, transform the verbs or formulae or whatever we have. And we will not be able to recognize today that these are not ancient Proto-Indo-European hereditary parts of the vocabulary, or formula, but something that took place in a later phase. So this is something that I think we have to consider. It's a possibility that something that disappears from our record when we.
Yeah, I've always, since reading about these similarities between Greek and Indo-Aryan, I now consider the two of them to be linked. And so although Greek is normally considered to be a Western Indo-European language and Indo-Aryan Eastern, in my mind, I now think there's a connection there that draws them together. And I sort of think of Greek as being in the middle.
I would like then to return to another one that you already raised, Guus, and that is Celtic Germanic, because obviously we also need studies of that interaction. And Adam did some studies in previously where you look into some very early forms of social institution in Germanic. And was it also in Celtic or?
Yes, so basically the new thing was to separate old loanwords from lexical material that looked Indo-European. Basically the type that Professor Mallory was mentioned before, the rock words, the rock, the like material that looks Indo-European in form, but it only occurs in one or two or three language groups. So I looked particularly at material from Celtic and Germanic and tried to remove all the stuff that looked like loanwords and only looked at ancient formations that were preserved in Celtic and Germanic only. And it turned out that they fall into two groups, which I would say two groups. Maybe perhaps other people could get more out of it, but it turned out that out of 100 items, around 100 items, about 90% fall into two groups, namely what I would call religion and healing. That's one group, and the other group is war terminology, including transport and equestrian terminology, so horses. And I just saw a review of that article yesterday in our review journal, Cartulos, and in fact, much of the criticism of the material tries to eliminate even more of that, which does not fall into these two groups. So I've been told that one of the verbs, for example, does not fall into these groups, and that just underlines the point.
That there are these two core groups.
Yes, and I think that if Celtic and Germanic were genetically related as a subgroup within Indo-European, you would see common material also out of these two groups, two packages.
But can you distinguish among these two groups or institutions what goes back to a shared past, or what is the result of their interaction in northern temperate Europe or in temperate Europe later on?
Yeah, I mean, the only conclusion I can come up with is that what we have is the material that looks old, so it must be old, but it doesn't go back to Proto-Indo-European because it's quite clearly shared only with Germanic and Celtic. But if it pointed to a genetic subgroup within Indo-European, it would not fall into two groups only.
Okay.
So it must reflect
a later historical situation.
Yeah, cultural contacts, but of specific kinds, namely involving war, specifically war, and equestrian terminology, and the smaller group is religion. And I think this...
And healing sounds quite reasonable when they're at war.
And all these, most of these terms predate the sound laws that define Celtic and Germanic.
Okay.
So it might be the Bronze Age.
Yeah. So when it's visible, they predate them. That means that it's before the sound laws take place. And I don't know if we don't have an absolute date of all the sound laws.
No.
But at least we can give a relative chronology. I might want to mention also that one specific subgroup within the war or healing terminology is words for wound. So there are 9 or 10 Celto-Germanic words for wound that look old, but they don't go back to Proto-Indo-European, or at least we cannot find them in other groups.
Different roots for different kinds of wounds?
Yes.
And we can certainly say from the skeleton material from the Bronze Age that we have more and more trauma recognized by archaeologists, and these are all kinds of wounds, from swords, from axes, from arrows. So because you have a whole diversified group of weapons at that time you didn't have in the early period. I think there's a comment here on that.
What you just heard is the tip of the iceberg. It's the tip of many work which has been done in the last 100 years. I think it's historical linguists do nothing else but comparing languages. And when I started with that in 1954, there was a famous word, I just don't remember, I become old, who compared all languages and counted them and wrote their percentages between them and so on. This is very old. What you mean must be done, but it can always be improved, and as I heard, can be very much improved.
And in a way, I think what we are beginning to realize here is that when we sit together and discuss and present our material, we realize we can become more specific than we thought we could before we met.
Yes.
And we can sharpen and specify our arguments, which I think must be a very important part of this exercise. Are there any comments among the panel here, Jim or
Well,
what we have just heard.
Just on that observation, if I could build a speculation on a good study, it just reminds me, 10 different words for wound. It reminds me of the language of...
It's 10%.
It's 10%. It reminds me of the language of the Iliad, you know, where there's such graphic description of the spear went in through his left eye socket and came out through his jaw, but this other guy, the spear went in through his collarbone and came out through the back of his head. The poetic descriptions of war are extremely explicit in terms of the kinds of wounds, and I wonder if some of this vocabulary might not have arisen from shared poetic traditions in the description of war. That's just a speculation.
Well, I guess in the Bronze Age, I don't know, maybe this is controversial, Germanic and Celtic still weren't completely, weren't that far from each other linguistically. I don't know. Is it actually, maybe I should ask this question to all the linguists, is it thinkable that a Proto or pre-Celt and a pre-Germanic person could still communicate in some way? Is it
Just for the rip-snorting hell of it, your book hadn't come out yet. One of the things I was going to try to do, but in the end I abandoned it, is I listed some of the vocabulary using Ranka Balashevic's reconstructions of Proto-Celtic versus Oral's Proto-Germanic, wondering that if I played this game with Proto-Italic as well, was I looking at it sort of a connubium of people who would have been mutually intelligible? And purely impressionistic, I was surprised to see how different they still were. Now, obviously, this is your game rather than mine, but I'm waiting maybe for the comparative Brill sub-language, reconstructions where you take, and also taking a look at, the Balto-Slavic reconstructions in the, in the Slavic etymological dictionary, what these things look like. You never see an etymological dictionary that actually gives you all of the proto-stages of the subgroups. At least I've never seen one, unless Leiden has got one that I can't afford, which is certainly possible, but where you actually saw right across on all these items, how far and how different.
And this question has some bearing upon our Archaeological interpretation of interaction. There's a comment here.
Yeah, it was just, if you could, you can't of course compare Proto-Germanic with Proto-Celtic directly, or you can do that, but they will be very different. But you have 3,000 years before that where they could have, where they would have been much closer, beginning from 3,500 BC, of course they were identical, and then 1,000 years later they could probably still, like you suggested, kind of make new terms, and they would have been similar enough to make new terms.
This is it. I expect convergence. It's where that convergence occurs chronologically, and that's where, although, once again, if there was full convergence, we would have Germano-Celtic as a phylogeny of Indo-European, and we don't.
Well, the difference that I said it to Morten, that the difference with linguistic and languages, or languages and genes, is that languages always remain fertile. So even if they don't look like each other, and when they're in contact with each other long enough, what you get is something in between, equilibrium. And I think 1000 BC, when the Germanic sound shifts not yet have taken place, I think Proto-Celtic and Proto-Germanic would be at a very similar stage, maybe not lexically, but phonetically, even maybe even grammatically.
Then I'm back to this old question. What happened between 2800 BC and 500 BC when you start of early Germanic, or do we call it Proto-Germanic or early?
Proto.
Yeah, I mean it could hardly be Proto, because what would it then call what went before these 1500, these 2000 years? Now, I was bold enough to suggest that those cordware groups that expand into the temperate northern European lowland, that they were some kind of Proto-Germanic. And we can clearly see a western and an eastern group. The western group is the one who goes from the Elbe up in Jutland and down to Holland. and Elbe Saale in that area, down to Halle. And then you have an eastern group in Poland that goes up into and enters Sweden and form an eastern group. And already there, and they evolved in Sweden and Jutland, Denmark, for several hundred years independently. So already there you might have even a Proto-East and West Germanic. What happens between, why can't you linguists come up with some model that accounts for this?
Yeah. And actually for Kroonen, where there's a more eastern spread, which is usually not talked about, Fatiano.
Which is probably what ended up
Baltic and Slavic.
Baltic and Slavic, yes.
Yeah.
And that also has its roots back in the mid 3rd millennium BC. So I mean, I want some answers from some models from the linguist here. Yeah.
Well, actually, I think we are asking for the models because we
have the archaeology, and
yeah,
we can show what it is.
You can show something, but what we can show is that 500 BC, and I think you agree, Chris, 500 BC there was a Proto-Germanic. It wasn't. We can't see any diversification at 500 BC. So what's before that was not West Germanic or pre-West Germanic or pre-East Germanic or North Germanic.
But you have Gothic. You have Gothic.
Yes, but Gothic also derives from something which was spoken, as far as we can see, 500 BC, maybe plus minus 500
So there
years.
you have the Eastern and the Western variety.
No, we don't have any varieties 500 BC. As far as we can see, it looks like one language.
There's no variety in Proto-Germanic.
Yeah, but you must have had Gothic at that time as well.
But we don't see any signs of it. That's the problem.
Yeah, if I may say something, it's just this terminological thing that David also mentioned, that we should think of a proto-language as the last stage before diversification. So the last stage before the first change that did not affect all.
Yeah, but what I can tell you, archaeologically speaking, is from this period, 2800 BC and down to your 500 BC, where you have attested things and call it Proto-Germanic, we have several cycles of the same kind of process that you have in the Iron Age. We have several cycles where first you have this broad thing, Western, Eastern France, then you have unification of culture and language in the South Scandinavian Nordic region, then you have a division again, then you have a unification again. It's very clear that you had a shared spoken language 500 BC down to 700 BC in South Scandinavia, in the Nordic region. And then it splits up again and you get Euro-Germanic. So the cycle you have from Euro-Germanic into Norse has already happened once or twice during that long period.
But with a different language.
Yeah.
The question is, which language?
Yeah.
Could that be a proto, or would that be some kind of Aryan or whatever? I don't know. I think we have a black box here.
No, I think, to go back to the genetics,
Yeah.
if you trace the genetics
Okay, a lot
back,
of people want to say something.
you're going to get lots of missing phylogenies. Dead. You go to, I can't remember statistics for Iceland, but you're predicting how many populations, theoretically, 5 generations ago survived in the current period. They're still represented there. Many of them have disappeared. And we could play the same game right across. I expect that in the phylogeny of Indo-European expansion, most of them have disappeared. We're only getting the last guy standing. They were in competition with one another. So when we talk about, we worry about Einar's situation, how early do you want your Germans in there? What may have been in there is either a vague form of Indo-European, which has never survived in any way, shape, or form. Sometimes, and the linguists don't talk much about this, other than maybe Leiden or some places like that, you'll get a Dutch linguist at least, you get a Nordwest block, you would get a little thing that seems to be halfway between Germanic and Russian and a handful of words that Cortland might be referring to, this type of a thing. That some of these may have made it through but only as a handful of a bit of the lexical vocabulary of an existing language. Go to the Celtic, for example. I have a major problem with your whole Celtic expansion, and that is reconstructed Proto-Celtic looks just about like Gaulish and Ogham Irish. It is so close. And if you follow Peter Schreiber here, Brittonic and Goidelic, spoken there, no major change, mutually intelligible probably to the 1st century AD. Therefore, saying that it's Beaker and that they separated 2,500 years before doesn't make much sense to me. What we're getting, when we're taking a look at Goidelic and Brittonic, is probably a linguistic battlefield that had existed between Indo-European languages in that area, and we're getting the lucky ones at the end. And they're the only lucky ones who have actually managed to make it through. And therefore, we're continually getting expansions of language. Recently I was reconsidering the Celticization of Ireland. If you want to believe the etymologies of Ptolemaic place names in Ireland, at least 1/4 of the island was speaking a Brittonic language. That is, it was not speaking a language ancestral to Irish, but they should have wound up singing in Welsh, male choirs and worshiping leeks instead of shamrocks. Nevertheless, there had to be a battle during the Iron Age, a dialectical battle between which dialect was going to survive. And Goidelic won, and that's why you have an Irish language. It could just as well have been Brittonic could have won, and Ireland could have had not a single trace of an Irish language. It would have had a Celtic language of some sort, a Brittonic language, but it wouldn't have been Irish. And I suspect right across Northern Europe, you had the same battle.
Language battles where in the end it was the random winner.
Yes, it's the random winner, and those are the only ones that we know exist. Everybody, only the winners write history.
But when you look at it in a big sense, it's not all random. I think of this as, if I could use a metaphor of a plowed field, and standing in for what archaeologists would call an interaction sphere. In other words, somebody comes in, clears the forest, plows a field and plants a crop. That's the first language. And then another farmer sometime later comes in and gets rid of that crop, that early language, and plants a different crop in the same field. But the field was defined by that first farmer. There's a historical continuity there that archaeologists are looking at, that are these interaction spheres that are cut out by human behavior, and they were populated by Indo-European languages. So they're important to study because they laid the ground, they plowed the field for the later emergence of Proto-Germanic or Proto-Celtic.
And if I may add there, that's a wonderful parable because early Germanic occupies the same geographical region more or less as the first expansion of single-wave culture. Now the word coming from two of you.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Adam.
Now a question perhaps with Guus also. We know of many loanwords in Finnish of Germanic. But now the question to the archaeologists, when did this happen? Or when could this have happened? Because always in the land, in the lowlands, we have the walls between the Finnish and the Germanics. And from Sweden, they had to cross the water.
Yeah, it happened in the Bronze Age. There were Nordic settlers going through the west coast of Finland.
In the Bronze Age.
Yeah.
Now, reckon when it was.
At least that's the first instance where I can point to it archaeologically.
No Germanic.
No, it's not. It's plowing the field.
It's plowing the field again. I like that one. I like that one. Now over to Adam.
Yes, I was just. You mentioned the Balanovo culture. Actually, when you said that you wanted us to come up with, linguistic models that fit your archaeological results, and actually, I think you're partly right that sometimes we we lack models because, at least in many cases, Indo-Europeanist linguists tend to forget that what we have is not necessarily only the lucky survivors of the original linguistic complexity, but also loanwords in neighboring language groups. And actually, for the Palando culture, it has recently been suggested by the Russian Vladimir Napolsky that a part of the Indo-European lexical stock in neighboring Finno-Ugric languages derived from some kind of Balto-Slavic, probably, possibly even Balto-Slavic. So the predecessor of Baltic and Slavic languages. Most linguists would agree that Baltic and Slavic derive from a common ancestor. And this language might also have left traces in Finno-Ugric language stages corresponding to it. But very often these languages that are reflected in loanwords in neighboring language groups are not mentioned as further branches of the Indo-European tree. So we mention these 12 Indo-European branches, but actually we have reflections of more. But they're just reflected only in loanwords.
I would like that reference, the Napolsky reference.
Yes, yes.
Any more? Yes?
To speak of Proto-Celtic Germanic, that's, in my opinion, far too ambitious. I don't think it would be possible. But as you mentioned, there are two members of the family who are closer than the rest of them, Baltic and Slavic. And one might speak about the Proto-Baltic Slavic stage. And I have read linguistics giving their opinions about that. And one thought it would be about 1200 before Christ. And I don't remember who that was. Another was much older, and he said about 400 before. And this I remember him. It was the French scholar Mallory. So about 400, perhaps 400 before Christ. That was after the time Herodotus wrote about the vast country north of the. So would that be any of the tribes he mentioned that would be identified with it?
Thank you. Are there any more comments to this debate? I think I have to realize that yes, that there is a black box that will never be opened for here and the North European plain here. Yes.
It's a bit of the same. Just simply, now we hear about the origin and the migration of the Indo-Europeans. Why did they not expand further?
Further where?
And we know now.
I think they expanded to the limit.
Yeah.
Okay, but what set the limit then?
The sea.
Yeah, the sea on one side, dense forest zone occupied by thriving Uralic speakers. On the north side, deserts and the Chinese civilization on the other side. Mesopotamia.
But we had civilizations in Europe also, I suppose. If we heard about the Tocharians, maybe there were other Indo-European speaking peoples there in the north or northwest China. Why did they not continue further? Why did they not continue down in India?
Because we know they didn't.
Well, they did. They did. But they entered. I think it's important to note that they entered India after the collapse of the urban civilization.
Yeah.
In northern India.
So it was open for them.
It was open.
Yeah, but okay.
I think ancient Indo-European speakers did not cause the collapse of urban civilizations, and came into equilibrium with people who came from urban civilizations. I'm thinking through, I can't think of.
If we look at the history of China, I mean, we have other peoples coming in and disturbing the civilization. So
much later.
Much later.
Much later.
I know it's much later. But
Chinese city life has never collapsed, has it?
Not entirely, no. Genghis Khan made an effort.
Yeah.
I would just like to hear Kristian and David's opinions, how they against each other about the Anatolians going to the west or to the east of the Black Sea. How sure are you that you're right?
We are not sure, but what we can show each of us, we are right about the archaeology. What accounts for who of them were the bearer of the carrier of the language, I don't know. I'm just given an option and saying there's something happened there that's very important in the Caucasus, and some of these people go south again. Some goes north in the steppe, some go south. They could be the early Hittites. And your archaeological migration is also very real. If they would carry a Hittite the whole way from the west to the east, here we have to ask the linguists what is most probably in a linguistic term. I don't know if Luvian and Hittite will have certain variations that would allow you to say which one is the earlier.
I feel, to be perfectly honest about this, I feel that the Trialeti culture, which Kristian was talking about, because he's talking about continuities in weapons technology, and there is a discontinuity in culture in the Caucasus with Trialeti and these big mound burials, and it's very unlike what came before. So it could be a migration. I mean, he's absolutely right.
But I even suggested it could be back in around 4000 with the Mycop.
But Mycop seems to me to be much more rooted in indigenous Caucasian cultures.
Yeah.
And Trialeti is almost a little too late.
So
that's why I prefer.
Because when we have the old Assyrians there, 1900 BC, you already have Hittite urban rulers and kings.
So that's why I think that the archaeological evidence for a real migration from the steppes to Anatolia is clearer if you go through southeastern Europe. It's possible.
And then you have this strange link between these organization of the fortified settlements, where you have nearly similar layout in Sintashta to the Urals and down in western Anatolia.
It's true, but I've never been convinced by it.
Oh, you haven't?
No.
Okay.
Because it's basically a circular settlement with houses on the inside, and it's so easy to come up with that.
I see. Yeah. Okay.
Well, when you ask such a question, can you say which is Luvian or Hittite? This is really something that is beyond our means, because all we can say is that both go back to Proto-Anatolian, and that's it. And we have our little notes, and simply the methodology doesn't allow us to answer all these questions. Also, what was
how can I be so sure?
Your methodology does allow you to estimate a date, for instance, for Proto-Anatolian.
Yeah, right.
That would be helpful for us.
That would be helpful.
Very helpful for us. That was a comment. And Morten.
Well, I would like to take the discussion in a slightly different direction, perhaps, but we'll still be in the same area in the Middle East, sometimes at least. The question about why didn't the Europeans spread any further? Well, I would like to take that up again, because there is one, well, he's not a scholar of Indo-European studies as such, but he's a member of this project, and he's a linguist called Whittick. He has suggested, I don't know if you know the theory, that there be a Indo-European substrate in Sumerian.
Superstrate.
A superstrate in my case. Yeah, it's a superstrate, you're right. Sorry? Whittaker, yeah. I would like to ask the archaeologists and the geneticists, would there be, I mean, it's highly controversial within linguistics, right? I would like to ask you, could there be any traces archaeologically and genetically of a migration of, or some kind of contact of Indo-European speaking peoples into the Sumerian area.
That's exactly what I talked about with the mycop.
Yeah, that would have to be my call.
Yeah, that's a link.
But what is this in time?
Mycop is connected light mycop is connected with a intermediate culture, Kura-Araxes culture, which covers a large part of the Caucasus. And Kura-Araxes definitely has an intrusion into lowland Mesopotamia after 3000 BC.
But before 3000 BC, you have the Uric expansion from Mesopotamia. Settlers and colonizers moving up to Anatolia and starting make the connections to exploit the copper mines.
I agree completely. Yeah.
And that's the late 4th millennium BC, mid to late.
But that evidence is going from south to north.
Yes.
I mean, the direction of flow of the cultural elements is going from Mesopotamia up to the Caucasus.
Yeah, but of course they would take something with them back home from these contacts.
To speak, I'm sorry, I don't want to take up, but there are tumuli which have been insufficiently explored. But one of the sites is Shea Girdan, Girdan, near Lake Urmia, that seem to represent a steppe type of grave that intrudes south as far as Lake Urmia during the Uruk expansion. Towards the end of it, maybe about 3000 BC.
Okay.
That would be the only possibility, but it doesn't go farther south than Lake Urmia.
But it would seem that the answer is yes, there is archaeological support. Åsa, and then?
Yeah, I have something on my wish list, both for archaeologists and linguists. And that, as an outsider, I can see that most of the discussion is about categories, meeting other categories, that we're looking for pieces of a puzzle, black holes that we want to find these pieces of. And my question is, we're trying to make maps. We're trying to mapping out everything. But what about if we should think a little bit different? I don't know if I will cause more problems or perhaps start to solve them. But what about if we think not to spatialize this, but to vitalize this and add the factor, the fluidity in time, that change may be rapid, change may be slow, different moments of the time. There might be multilingual people. One material culture could be 2 languages, a ritual language, common people language, or there might be languages between for trading, economics. People can handle many languages.
So you're suggesting hybridity?
Yes. What about if we start to ask these questions? Are there these type of people? What kind of traces would they leave? How could they communicate in the material culture? How was the material culture used between different groups? Just my wish.
There's not much evidence, though. I mean, you could talk about this for hybridity between Indo-European and non-Indo-European.
Yeah,
I would say there's plenty.
There's plenty of evidence.
Plenty of evidence, only it has been overlooked for decades and maybe more than a century. So my lecture was about the Germanic lexicon, and I think you can, and the only one, you can really easily see the difference between different layers, and these different layers correspond to different cultures originally, probably, and languages in the first place. And it's, well, the only solution to this is to assume that this Indo-European dialect that invaded Northern Europe, that became kind of an international language, probably like maybe the Bronze Age language of trade or something, and the original people started to learn that, and maybe, yeah, that, of course they must have been bilingual for a period.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering to what extent archaeologists are using historically well-attested examples of nomadic, sedentary interactions to try to create a model out of those examples that can be applied to prehistoric periods? Because there are such examples,
Sure,
well-attested ones, and I would assume that there are certain patterns emerging from those.
I learned a lot reading the social anthropology of nomadic social organization.
Yeah.
Many years ago, when I wrote before Europe for History, I had a chapter on that, and I used a lot of ethnographic evidence there to help me interpret.
The starting point, I think, for any archaeologist discussing this has always been Frederick Barth.
Yes, exactly.
The start with Frederick Barth, because he offers you some of the finest, clearest principles by which you form further arguments. Some of them counterintuitive, which are particularly useful, because archaeologists will normally follow what seems to be common sense, which is very often wrong, unless you have looked at enough examples to realize there are deeper processes operating. So I know both, certainly David and myself, Frederick Barth, you start with Frederick Barth.
I didn't, this was not, to me it was not Frederick Barth because he's about ethnicity. Mostly, to me, I was interested in social organization and principles of how you construct these horizontal networks. So I read into the ethnographic literature about nomads, some of the Russian, some of the North African. There are a lot of French and English researchers on that subject too. I haven't really followed up in recent years, but there was a time when I really went deeply into it, and it was really helpful.
Yeah.
Because it made me understand that you can have complex social systems that appear not to be complex on the surface because the complexity is horizontal. That's what I call decentralized complexity.
The Frederick Barth's political economy of the SWAT pattern. That's a great example. He describes exactly the social mechanisms through which the Pathan came into the Swat Valley in the 16th century, so it's not it's not a modern thing, and established what he called islands of authority, and that phrase has just stuck in my mind because I think that's the way ancient migrations really worked. They weren't waves. They ended up with little pockets, islands of authority, and that's how I think of Yamnaya migrations.
Yeah.
It's not this river or a wave. It's a few chiefs establishing islands of authority and then attracting clients from the local populace to build up their patron-client business. And that's exactly what the SWAT, that's where I got the idea, it's what the SWAT, and then these islands of authority slowly, over many decades or centuries, coalesce and begin to come together and form larger, overarching political units where the chiefs are competing with each other, and slowly the local community switches its language to Pathan. That's pretty much my model for how